Hello, my name is Jim Sloan. I'm a lecturer in the School of Architecture at BIAD. I'd like to start by thanking Alan Mortiboys for the title for this presentation. The announcement that I was single-handedly redesigning the entire architecture curriculum grabbed quite a bit of attention in the staff office. Clearly a little bit of exaggeration is a useful technique in academic life. And you probably guessed that I'm not going to be looking at the entire architecture curriculum, but instead focusing on one part of it. And that part is detailed design. Now let me give a bit of an explanation of what I mean by that. If we look at other creative subjects like painting and sculpture, they result in the production of a final artefact. But architecture relies on the provision of a set of detailed information for others to act upon to create the final building. That detailed information typically comprises drawings, and these need to show a lot of information, dimensions, materials, specialist components, and so on. And by way of example, here are a pair of drawings from a first year student. First of all, we'll look at a cross-section of the proposed building, and this is often described as a general arrangement drawing, as it shows the spatial relationships of the whole building. Second, we see a detailed cross-section showing the components making up each element of the building: walls, floors and roofs. And it's this second type of drawing that, in my opinion, is a key aspect of employability for students and their ability to develop an approach to producing this kind of drawing. And I think this type of output is daunting for many students and indeed many practitioners. And my own experiences in practice are that I was poorly prepared for this type of work by my training at university. The first job I had after graduating, I had a very positive experience for around about the first 12 months, working through concept design and then towards planning submission. But as soon as we moved into detailed design phase, I felt that the type of information that I'd been taught about at university was not very helpful and didn't work with the type of project I was looking at, and I had really no sound basis on which to develop detailed designs for the project I was working on. And I was heavily reliant on colleagues to help me through that period and really to pick up fundamentals of the design process. And whilst I was able to get that kind of input from colleagues, I think this is more and more difficult for students coming into the workplace now, as fees are squeezed by the current economic climate, and their training really has to accommodate this within university. So for a moment, let's consider the conventional approach to teaching in this area of the curriculum, and certainly this was the method that I experienced as an undergraduate. First of all, the word construction is most commonly used to describe the activity of detailed design within architecture schools. So there are lectures within construction, there are reference books with titles like An Introduction to the Construction of Buildings. Now, this use of language might seem unimportant, but it signals a separation of this area of curriculum from design activity. And the further evidence of this separation is the choice of teaching environment and content for construction teaching. Whilst teaching is firmly rooted for design in the studio, the construction teaching often takes place in the lecture theatre. And the technical aspects of construction are introduced using sectional drawings of typical details. These details illustrate commonplace building methods using materials that are familiar to students, so brick walls, tiled roofs and so on. And the central theme of this teaching is most often whether or not it will work. And in this context, work means whether or not it will keep the weather out, whether or not it can be built, and whether or not it complies with statutory legislation. And visual qualities are rarely discussed, maybe only in terms of the type of material employed in the typical details. Now, this method offers a clear and uncomplicated view of construction that helps to introduce students to the subject. So by focusing on the functional aspects, students are able to develop a vocabulary of construction detailing quite quickly, but it has its limitations. Any ambitions outside of the typical detailing really are difficult to accommodate, and visual requirements, if they're not able to be composed from the palette that we're given, then we're left to guess really what the correct solution might be. And I think that's very much the situation I found myself in practice. But surely education's moved on since I was a student. Well, I have to say, since the 2 years when I've been in academia, I've found that it hasn't. And even worse, I think, is that the reference books I used as a student are still on the shelves of the library, and the contents haven't been updated. We'll have a look in particular at this detail, which is a blown up portion of that detail cross-section we just looked at. And I won't go through the shortcomings of it, but there are a number of areas where it wouldn't be acceptable nowadays in terms of weather tightness, thermal performance, and a number of other issues including maintenance. And this detail is still available as a point of reference for students today. The key lesson I learned in practice is that knowledge soon becomes obsolete. So legislation, standards, technology are updated all the time in construction. And to be effective in practice, students need to be able to find the information they need and apply it to the situation at hand. And in some ways this is a challenge to conventional modes of learning where we might be looking to acquire a relatively fixed body of knowledge. We move more towards a framework for acquiring new knowledge all the time. So this typical detail introduction needs to be supplemented by a framework that encourages exploration and accommodates new knowledge. In other words, even if we don't know the answer to a problem, we can have confidence in our ability to tackle it through a systematic framework. The key to this new framework is the division of design into two areas: performance criteria and visual criteria. First of all, let's look at performance criteria. And these are the qualities of a building that can be numerically quantified. For example, thermal insulation is usually measured by its U value. This is similar to the TOG rating of a duvet, and so we can assign a number to that. Many other aspects of a building's performance can be measured. These include the structural strength, the fire resistance, the acoustic performance, and so on. And it's possible to define the performance criteria early on in a project, as they're not dependent on the visual aspects of the design. The performance criteria are driven by the brief for the building and its geographical location. In addition, the performance criteria will change over time as regulations and standards are updated, so the emphasis here is on using knowledge of the relevant criteria to establish performance for each project on an individual basis. Next, the visual criteria, and these are defined in the design drawings. And the drawings contain a huge amount of information about the project in terms of shape, texture, colour, jointing, so on. And this is the information that students develop in the normal course of their design studio projects. And these visual criteria are just as important as the performance criteria. This is an issue the typical detail methodology doesn't really accommodate, so it can often result in detailed design output by students that is driven by the typical detail rather than by the original design proposal. So armed with the performance criteria and the visual criteria for a project, a student, or for that matter a practitioner, can develop a meaningful detailed design proposal. Often this requires input from specialist manufacturers. And in this regard, the internet, including specialist online databases, has been hugely beneficial. And often web-based resources are below par for academic use, but for construction information, building products regulations and so on, the web has been very helpful and contains the most up-to-date information. So how might this work in practice? Well, over the last 2 years I've been using a series of seminars with our second year students to introduce these ideas. The seminars are held in the studio space and they run alongside design studio teaching. And the final output from this teaching is a 1 to 20 section of the student's project, and this is assessed as part of the design studio module. So absolutely embedded with design studio teaching in the way it's taught and in the way it's assessed. I think the success of this has been limited to date. Partly this may be down to the time given over to this aspect within the studio. More significantly perhaps is the lack of a general introduction through the typical detail method. However, I do feel there has been some success. Students start to understand detail design through the visual criteria, and this reinforces the idea that it is an extension of their studio work. So here's an example of some of the resources that we use within those detail design seminar sessions, and we ask students to start with the visual information using the photograph on the left hand side of the screen, work towards the detail on the right hand side of the screen using a drawing exercise. And that drawing exercise is carried out in pairs, and I think this has resulted in a really lively atmosphere in the studio during those sessions, and I think this has really encouraged engagement by the students. The question of output and assessment has come up a number of times within the AAP, and my instinct is that the output should move away from the final single piece that we have at the moment and move more towards a collection of evidence that demonstrates the process, so that students are really encouraged to work with the framework to develop their detailed design proposals. And after all the discussion we've had, I think that is still my view. How it's described, is it a journal, is it a portfolio? I'm not sure, that's still undecided. So my final reflection is that the AP has helped me to make some sense of why the conventional methods of teaching detailed design are problematic and why the new framework is important. But I hope this isn't the end of the story, and the idea is that this will now, this piece of work here will help to develop a research project that will move these ideas forward and develop the teaching methodology in much more detail. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your comments.